to our panel on Russia-Ukraine and the importance of Crimea. My name is Lloyd Layton. I'm the president of the International Studies Honor Society, Sigma Iota Rho. On behalf of Sigma Iota Rho and the Masters of Arts in International Studies, I want to thank you all for taking time out of your busy lives to join us this evening. We originally were inspired to have an event regarding the implications of the associated Winter Olympics. But however, with the recent annexation of the Crimean Peninsula, there couldn't have been a better time for this panel. On that note, it's my honor to introduce our panel of guests. Our very special guest, Mr. Allan Ellis, graciously came all the way from Oregon this afternoon. Mr. Ellis attended San Carlos High School, where he was among the first group of Bay Area high school students to complete a 4-year course in Russian language studies. He attended William M University in Salem, Oregon, where he graduated with a double major in Russian and political science, and went on to earn a Master of Education degree, also at William M University. Mr. Ellis taught Russian and social studies on the high school level in Portland, Oregon for more than 30 years, which included a decade-long student exchange program with a sister school in Khabarovsk, Portland's sister city in the Russian Far East. Over the years, he's traveled extensively in Russia, from the Russian Far East to European Russia, and served as a translator and consultant in the making of a documentary film about the history of the boreal forest surrounding Lake Baikal. Upon retirement from full-time teaching, Mr. Ellis worked for 8 years as an adjunct instructor in the graduate education department at Portland State University. He's currently president of the Portland Khabarovsk Sister City Association and will be leading a delegation to Khabarovsk this coming May. And then our next two guests are some of the most influential political science professors I've had here at Chapman. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Bojan Petrovic. Dr. Bojan Petrovic lectures in the political science department at UCLA and in the international studies program at UC Irvine. His areas of expertise include ethnic, communal, and other intrastate conflicts, state and nation building, and theories of international relations with a geographic focus on the Middle East and Central Asia. His current research interests are in Islam and politics and the general role that religion plays in international relations. He recently published 2 books, Afghanistan, The Political History of a Buffer State, which I've personally read, and Islam and Temporal Power. Last but not least, it's my honor to introduce Dr. James J. Coyle. Over the past 30 years, Dr. Coyle has held a number of positions in the federal government, including Director of Middle East Studies at the U.S. Army War College, First Secretary for Political Military Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Ankara, Senior Political Analyst for Palestinian Affairs, and Special Assistant to the FBI, New York Joint Terrorist Task Force. He is co-author of Politics of the Middle East, Culture and Conflict, which was published in 2003. Dr. Coyle speaks and/or reads Turkish, Persian, and French in various degrees of proficiency. Dr. Coyle received his bachelor's in foreign service from Georgetown, his master's in public administration from Temple University, and a PhD in political science from George Washington University, and currently serves as the director of the Center of Global Education here at Chapman. Without further ado, I'm going to pass the torch to our VP of Special Events, John O'Connell, to get us started with some questions regarding the situation in Ukraine.
All right.
Let's give a round of applause first for our special guest.
Thank you everyone for coming out. We really appreciate it, and I think we have a good group of guests here to analyze what's going on in Russia and Ukraine and all the craziness that's been happening. Basically, brief background for you guys. While a lot of us are here out of interest, some of us are here to learn more. So Ukraine has political protests, and they basically were able to overthrow the leadership, and out of that, Russia came in to Ukraine to protect their interests, especially with their naval base within the Crimean Peninsula, and that's kind of where all this has come about. So these questions will not only serve to educate, but also to go into more in-depth discussion. The first question's to Mr. Ellis. With your experience with the people living in Russia, how connected do the people in Russia feel towards those that live in Crimea?
Well, my first time to Russia, to the Soviet Union, was in college. By the way, wherever Lloyd is, we went over pronunciations, but the small college I went to, I attended in Oregon, is Willamette University, and it's named after one of the main rivers that runs north and south and through Portland. At any rate, when I went over there in '68, we started in Leningrad, and we made our way down south by train, and went through Kiev, and went to, ended up in Sochi, as a matter of fact, back then. And it was a seamless, transition from the north of the Soviet Union to the south. And when you talk about Ukraine, you talk about Kiev, people would say, oh yeah, it's warmer down there, there's sunshine, it's it's festive. They had a real positive take on Ukraine. And as I returned to Russia many times, I'd be sitting with groups that would start singing and parties, and there would always be Russians singing Ukrainian songs. They knew all the words, so it was just that Ukraine was integrated so well into the Soviet Union and accepted by the ethnic Russians. There didn't seem to be any problems between the two. There was intermarriage, lots of intermarriage. Usually when you a last name, a Russian name, ends in an O, it often is a Ukrainian name. There's lots of examples of that. And so one of the things that happened during the Soviet era was that the Soviets made sure that there were ethnic Russians in all the 14 other republics. When you were going for a job after graduating from college, you'd sit before a board, they would go over your education, and they would assign you. If you were a young teacher, you might be assigned to a rural area that needed teachers, but also in Kazakhstan or somewhere, or Ukraine, where they might need, where more ethnic Russians were needed. In 1991, when the Soviet Union fell, Latvia, for instance, was around half ethnic Russian. What did the Latvians do? Right after independence, they decided that Latvian was going to be the main language, that Russian was no longer going to be, to get back at the, for all those years where they had to learn Russian and everything. What you're seeing today in Ukraine seems to be this, in some ways, the same phenomenon, where the ethnic Russians that have been living mostly in the eastern part of Ukraine and down in the Crimea are feeling that they have been shortchanged in a number of different ways, and so there's a real split, and it's surprising that this is happening after all the years of harmony and intermarriage between Russians and Ukrainians.
Well, thank you very much. Dr. Coyle, the next question's for you. The news has emphasized the strategic importance of a Russian naval base in Crimea. Why is this base so important, and why did Russia feel the need to invade Crimea in the name of national security?
It's actually two separate questions. The naval base is important because it has all the naval assets of the Russian Navy for the Black Sea, and by extension from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean Sea. So to control access to that base, that's highly important. Now, the Russians had permission to use that base. They have a treaty with Ukraine. It was extended 2 years ago, I think, to 2042 in return for a reduction in the cost of natural gas that Ukraine was purchasing from Russia. So that's not the real reason. From a strategic viewpoint, the reason for the invasion of the Ukraine, and I emphasize this is just the strategic explanation, there's lots of other reasons as well, but from a strategic viewpoint, Ukraine is the doorway to the Russian steppes. It's 300 miles from Ukraine to Moscow, and when you realize that certainly during Stalin's period, the whole idea was to have this cordon sanitaire that would kept the Russia protected from I can't speak tonight, I'm sorry, encroachment from the West, and then once we started to expand NATO, and once Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania come into NATO, St. Petersburg, Leningrad, which up until 1991 had been 1,000 kilometers from the NATO border, was now 100 kilometers. And so now with Ukraine, there has been a lot of discussion about giving Ukraine a member action package which would allow them eventually to join NATO. And that would have put them put NATO within 300 kilometers of Moscow. And we can't have that. The Russians wouldn't have.
Thank you very much. Dr. Petrovic, with Russia taking aggressive actions towards their Ukrainian neighbors, some have likened Putin's actions to those taken by Hitler with the invasion of the Rhineland. How likely is it that Putin will stop with Crimea, and is there a scenario where Russia moves into other former Soviet Union republics?
Well, there is an article in the New York Times today, that's an op-ed piece by one of the columnists, Roger Coyle. He actually lays out the scenario where the crisis in Crimea actually escalates into war, and then he draws the analogy between what's going on in Crimea now and what happened prior to World War I, which sort of then led to a major crisis then. I don't see that happening. I don't think he is serious in arguing that. He is just trying to point out how serious this crisis is, and it is likely to destabilize Ukraine for an extended period of time, because among other things, by annexing Crimea, the situation inside of Ukraine is likely to be aggravated because the balances among various groups, minorities, and majorities is what is going to be disturbed. And as a result of this, the country that has had trouble finding and defining its national identity the moment it became democracy, and sort of experimenting with Ukrainian as official language and Russian as official language, and moving back and forth. I think this is very destabilizing, and that is worrisome.
Dr. Coyle, the U.S. and its allies have discussed economic sanctions on Russia. What kind of sanctions would be implemented, and which industries are going to be affected the most?
What they're talking about are quote-unquote targeted sanctions against individuals that are involved in the invasion. You know this, but others don't. I have a very low opinion of the possibility of sanctions doing anything. Among other things, the first thing you have to do when you're talking about imposing sanctions, you have to ask yourself, to what effect? What are you trying to accomplish by putting these sanctions on? And frankly, our government doesn't have an answer to that question. Our government wants to signal that we're unhappy, but short of giving up the Crimea, is there anything that Russia could do that would thereby say to us, okay, we're going to lift the sanctions? The answer to that is no. So are we therefore putting ourselves in a position where we go into a semi-permanent status of sanctioning people surrounding the invasion of the Ukraine? And how effective will that be? Well, just ask Fidel and Raul Castro, who have been under sanctions for 65 years now, and how has that affected their hold on power? It hasn't.
Thank you very much. Dr. Petrovic, recently Russia has been acting more like an empire than a neighbor towards its former republics. With Putin largely viewed as a nationalist, does this affect how the U.S. and its allies can respond to aggressive Russian actions in the future?
Well, let me try to explain where this aggressiveness of Putin comes from, and I think it's very much related to what Professor Coyle pledge to the Russians after the disintegration of the Soviet Union that NATO would not extend into areas of East Europe and former Soviet republics. And that pledge has been violated. It has not been honored by the United States during the Clinton administration, when the promises were made not just to extend the European Union into Central and East Europe, but also to extend NATO into places such as Poland and the Baltic republics, and that is something that the Russians didn't like. So the process of expansion of NATO has also signaled the possibility of Georgia and Ukraine falling into the NATO alliance, and that is something that the Russians regard as the red line. And the situation in Ukraine is one that is in large part triggered by the decision of Putin that this is something that Russia is not going to tolerate, messing with Ukraine, messing with the possibility of Ukraine sort of falling into the sphere of interest of the European Union and NATO is something that the Russians want to oppose. And that comes also as a result of the desire of Putin to somehow raise questions about what the United States did in Kosovo, for example, in 1999, when the decision was made to, literally, the phrase used by Vice President Biden today is land grab from Ukraine. Well, from the perspective of Russians, there was a land grab of Kosovo away from Serbia in 1999, and that is something that Russians were not all too happy about. Then came the intervention in Libya, something that was expedited by the British and the French, and the United States joined. The mandate of the Security Council was to help protect the rebels who were being attacked from air by the Gaddafi forces. Well, the intervention went way beyond that, and the Russians, together with the Chinese, were very, very annoyed by the fact that things were being done behind their backs, and that explains, in part, aggressiveness. I'm not saying that this is the only explanation. This, in part, explains the aggressiveness of Putin. And I don't think that aggressiveness of Putin is something that came out of the blue for people who are involved in monitoring what's going on in this part of the world.
Well, thank you. Mr. Ellis, at this point in the conflict, there appears to be very few options that the international community could take to counter Russian aggression. Looking back at history, are there lessons from the past that we could use to find solutions to the conflict in Crimea?
Well, let's look at the options. We talked a little bit about sanctions. If you freeze the assets of the oligarchs in Russia, if you put restrictions on visas for people to travel, for those in high positions in the government and in business to travel to the United States or to Europe, this can put some pressure on the economy. After all, Putin came in after Yeltsin. Yeltsin, at the end of his term, at the late 90s, you had a complete meltdown of the economy. Some of my teacher friends in Havadas, where our important sister city, lost their life savings at the end of the 90s. Putin comes in, and the buzzword for there was that experiment of a decade of democracy and capitalism, which for all kinds of reasons didn't work very well at all. And so the average Russian said stability. And Putin came in and was able to stabilize the economy. The runaway inflation, the shortages, those started disappearing. Today, though, we're in an interesting situation because you have such interdependence, economic interdependence. This crisis is affecting the G8, soon probably be G7. The industrialized countries of the world, because they're so interrelated and dependent upon each other for trade. So I guess what I'm saying is there's a possibility that sanctions could put enough pressure on Putin to explore diplomatic ways of getting out of this. Diplomatically, we have to find some kind of an off-ramp, to use an LA freeway metaphor. Because if we don't find an off-ramp, then it just keeps ramping up and up. Now, Charles Krauthammer, a conservative editorialist, wrote a column earlier this week suggesting that what we should do, or saying this is what we should do, we should send over a whole bunch of military aid to the Ukrainians in the West, and then send over advisors, trainers, to teach them how to use the equipment. It sound familiar? You studied Vietnam. His calculus is that the Russians would never fire on Europeans or American trainers. If they did, it would start a major deal. This would be a way of protecting the eastern Ukraine from an invasion of Putin. So that's one of the options that has been suggested. And of course, the third rail of this is diplomacy. And for all of you studying international relations, what a fascinating crisis to be living through right now. It reminds me of when I was in high school living through the Cuban Missile Crisis and wondering how in the world we were going to get through this without a thermonuclear war, because both sides seem to be entrenched, and both the advisors on the Soviet side and on the American side, military advisors, congressmen, they were advising Kennedy to bomb Cuba, take out those missiles, kill a bunch of Russians that were there, whatever. And Khrushchev said, we'll retaliate. They found a way. They saw that this could lead to Armageddon, back then. The tensions were. Now we're faced with two sides that have nuclear weapons. Europe, U.S., NATO, and Russia. And I don't think that it would get to that point. But the World War I analogy, that thing started out of as a result of an assassination and all kinds of different alliances, and before you knew it, you had a war going. And war is a lot more dangerous now, of course, with nuclear weapons than it was before. So those are your options. You've got diplomacy, you've got military, you've got the sanctions, and probably a combination of the three.
Thank you very much. Dr. Coyle, the United States has grown into a hegemony with a lot of power within the international community. From the U.S. point of view, do you think Russia's lack of cooperation and care poses a threat to U.S. power? I'll give you a nice softball question then.
You know where I'm going to go with this. And it actually refers back to a question that you asked Dr. Petrovic as well. Here's the problem. Everybody in this room has been told since the day you were born that we won the Cold War. So we don't have to worry about the Russians anymore. The Russians are our friends. They're kinder, gentler people. We just have to be nice to the Russians. They'll be nice to us because they know their place. We won the Cold War. They lost. The problem is nobody told the Russians that they lost the Cold War. And the Russians have been trying to get back ever since. They haven't changed. They haven't changed their outlook. If you read the National Security Strategy of 2001, which was basically written on Yeltsin's watch, but was released as Putin takes power, it identifies that Russia's #1 enemy is the West. If you look at the National Security Strategy of 2010, put out when Medvedev was in charge, it says the Russian enemy is the West. We may have said we won the Cold War, but nobody told the Russians that they lost it. And so they just sat there and said, well, we've taken a major hit here. We've lost our Eastern European empire, and the Soviet Union is now 15 independent countries or 17 independent countries. But Russia hasn't changed any, and realist political theory. Whether you're looking at Morgenthau, who's arguing on the basis of the nature of man, or whether you're looking at Kenneth Waltz, who's arguing it's the nature of the international system, you still come down to the same thing, and that is that every country needs to protect themselves. And when Russia looks out and sees a country who bombed the Balkans, who bombed Libya, who is talking about setting up alliances with Georgia and setting up alliances with Ukraine, who has broken the word that they gave back in the 1990s. It's not that we're a hegemon. It's not that, Russia's not friendly anymore. They have to protect their interests. We have to protect ours.
Thank you very much. Dr. Petrovic, is it possible that Russia's defiance may set the tone or encourage others to disregard international law that has been put into place?
You mean by annexing Crimea
Correct.
or
Through their defiance towards the West and their disagreement over the legality of annexing Crimea?
Well, following up with this claim about, or this reference to realism, school of thought, this is always dangerous, but on the other hand, the Russians perceive this as an act of reciprocation in return to what the United States has done in Kosovo, in Libya, and it is certainly dangerous, but from their perspective, it's something that is a quid pro quo sort of action, and it is unlikely to be repeated by smaller powers, but realism is not interested in smaller powers anyway. So realism discusses great powers, and great powers are signaling to each other that all this talk about international law and violation of sovereignty is to be put aside, because the Russians would like to see the unipolar moment of the United States sort of fading away and restoring some kind of balance. And in the case of Ukraine, that may be just the creation of some kind of a buffer zone that the Russians will be happy with. And that buffer zone that the Russians will be happy with would be a federal Ukraine, where the interests of the eastern part were to be protected to the liking of the Russians.
Thank you. Mr. Ellis, to kind of follow up that question about international law, does Russia have any rights or justification regarding the independence, quote unquote, of Crimea? Or does Crimea actually have any actual right to break away from Ukraine?
Well, let me start by putting forth a little bit of a different viewpoint on Putin and the Russians and their desire to not lose the Cold War, to assert themselves, assert what they consider to be their legitimate interests, which, of course, in Ukraine goes back many centuries. I think that probably had this revolution, or whatever you want to call it, in Kiev, had it not happened, I think Putin would have ended the Sochi Olympics all happy and gone on his way and not invaded anybody. But there was always this stuff smoldering below the surface. All the idea that you had disgruntled ethnic Russians, 60% of the Crimea being ethnic Russian, eastern Ukraine, especially in Kharkov, and with the Russian fleet down there, and also the strange way, 1990, let's see, when was it? 1956 or so, whenever it was, in the 50s, where Khrushchev gifted the Crimea to the Ukraine, from Ukraine himself, and at the time it was no big deal because it was the Soviet Union, and it was all one big happy family. So it's kind of a strange thing. Putin is looking at the Kiev and the what happened there as a coup. And that Yanukovych was deposed by a group of armed people who forced him out. And the other side, the Ukrainians look at what's happening in the Crimea as a coup as well, led by Russian troops. And of course, Putin hasn't even admitted that there are Russian troops there. He said that they're Ukrainian, Russian-speaking Ukrainian militia, which is a little strange. Both sides are accusing each other of a coup. Both sides are saying the other has an illegitimate government. So how can you sit down and bargain, negotiate with an illegitimate government? Putin, and the pretext of this violence and everything has resulted in Putin being able to send troops in to save the lives of ethnic Russians. He can make the same, use the same excuse to go into the eastern Ukraine. This whole thing is also, I think, exacerbated by the ethnic Russians in Ukraine. You wonder one wonders how many Ukrainians, be they Russian-speaking Ukrainians or Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians, how much of them really are into this whole revolution thing, and what percentage does this vanguard represent? You have in Kharkov yesterday, you have signs with Nazi signs on them calling the regime in Kiev fascist, hearkening back to World War II, Nazi invasion. You have drunkenness, you have a lot of nationalism and violence, and to make everything even more complicated, you have Yanukovych, the leader of Ukraine, who, as a result of the corruption of his regime, the economy of Ukraine has tanked. And then you've all seen the palace that Yanukovych lived in. It was just incredibly corrupt. He was incredibly corrupt. And he was, voted out, but, not only because of his corruption, but also he was blamed for the deaths on the Maidan, the independent square. So it's extremely complex, because you have this corrupt government, and also ethnic Russians, when they're interviewed, have been saying that, maybe if we go with Russia, the economy will pick up. It's been a horrible economic situation with Yanukovych. Younger Ukrainians some of them are talking about the EU being a better bet. But the economic situation is a major criterion there.
Thank you very much. Right now, we'd like to open up to student questions, so you can either ask the panel as a collective or as an individual on the panel. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Go.
I'll ask the panel at large, if I may, about what any of you think is the kind of future in regards to eastern Ukraine and the large percentage of Russians, ethnically Russian population there, kind of what that means in the future for military action on either side or political action, and kind of where those allegiances lie.
I've written 3 columns on the Ukraine in the last month. 2 of them I make predictions, and both of them were wrong, so I'm not going to make predictions.
Go ahead.
I think I'll just repeat what I said, and that is that I think the Russians would be willing to accept some kind of federal structure of the state of Ukraine that would guarantee significant amount of autonomy for the Russian-speaking population. Now, will that happen? Is very difficult to predict. I think the situation in Ukraine as a result of this annexation is very unstable and is likely to continue to be so. And I think there is a potential for a larger conflict and involvement of Russian troops in
I can't see Putin giving back Crimea. I mean, Putin went before the Duma today, and basically it's, by tomorrow you're going to have an annexation document passed by the Duma. Today it happened. So I can't see him going back. Putin is the guy who not only brought stability, economic stability, but he brought back some pride, some Russian pride, and he also embodies the mujik, the kind of macho Russian. You know, he's going around with his shirt off, he's on a horse, all this stuff. You know, and he asked the photographers to take these photos and distribute them. I mean, it's his deal. He's set up a cold personality. So why do I get into that? Because we're dealing with Putin controls Russia. The Duma is a rubber stamp. His party is dominant. So whatever he wants, he's going to get. I just can't see him giving back Crimea. Now, I think there's and also with the Baltic Fleet down there in Sevastopol, I just think that he just feels like Khrushchev should have never given that, made that part of Ukraine in the first place. Now it's rightfully back. As far as eastern Ukraine, though, one possible thing that might happen, Kiev is going to hold elections at the end of May. There's an interim government right now. So they're going to hold elections for parliament and prime minister, whatever. And at that time, perhaps this idea of a federal situation could take root, and you could find some compromise there. But boy, the Crimea, I can't see, as long as Putin's in power, I just can't see him giving back allowing the Crimea to be independent of Russia. I think it's part of Russia.
If you look at recent history, and of course every situation is slightly different than the other. We haven't until today had a situation where Russia is re-annexing parts of its former empire. But if you look at the history going back the last 20 years, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, as the Soviet Union was collapsing, separatists in Transnistria, in Moldova, announced that the Russian-speaking peoples there couldn't protect themselves against the Moldovan majority. They separated. The Russians then came in as peacekeepers, put troops there. And guess what? Troops are still there. If you go a little bit further, in Georgia, again, you had the Ossetians, you had the Abkhazians. They said, oh, we've got large populations of Russian citizens here. They can't protect themselves against the Georgian majority. Therefore, we're going to pull ourselves away. We're going to be separatists. The Russians then sent in troops as peacekeepers. And eventually, when Georgia tried to take it back by force, we had the Georgia War of 2008, and now they're considered independent countries. Going a little bit further to the east, the ethnic, in Nagorno-Karabakh, the ethnic Armenians said, oh, we can't protect ourselves against the Azerbaijani majority. We need to be independent. This time the Russians didn't send in their own troops, but they backed the Republic of Armenia when they sent their troops in. And today, the largest military base, the largest Russian military base outside of Russia is in Armenia. Now you've got the same situation. You've got the Ukraine. Oh, guess what? We can't protect ourselves. We're Russian speakers. We're Russian citizens. Russia, you have to send in armed forces to save us. Well, the Russians are sitting where they were in 1988 in Moldova, in 1988 in Georgia, in 1994 in Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia. We're in for a long way.
This came up briefly in this last discussion, but to the whole panel, what do you see as being the future of Putin's role? Do you see him continuing on as ruler of Russia until his death, stepping down at some point and appointing a successor, or do you see the people of Russia eventually rising up and overthrowing him?
I don't see that ever happening. You know what Vladimir means? Conqueror of the universe. apropos of somebody's self-image. And you know, right now he's got popularity that's between 70 and 80% among the Russian citizenry. He's always been popular. When they did the switchback, when he took over from Medvedev, his popularity went down because the young people thought that he was endangering the little bit of democracy that there is in Russia. But he's right back up on top where he always was.
So far he used the constitutions in order to justify his leading position. Will that continue? We'll see, because he started off as president and then switched to become prime minister, and he's now serving as prime minister. Will he switch back to presidency and once again change the constitution of the country in order to increase the powers of the presidency that he had to minimize in order to become the chief executive as prime minister is anyone's guess. But I don't see him being removed from power anytime soon. I think he has a very good control of the political opposition, and be that Garry Kasparov, the former chess world champion, or anyone else, he can silence and deal with them. He can deal with oligarchs who may try to mobilize against him, and those who thought that they could ended up in jail, as you may know. So I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah, you know, besides these power moves that he can make against his opposition, he's also put in place something like the government had in the Soviet era, where, for instance, there's a youth group. It's a lot like the Young Pioneers during the Soviet times. It's called Nashi, which means our, our land, our whatever. And they have summer camps for the kids, and that's very nice, because a lot of the Young Pioneer camps just went by the wayside when the Soviet Union collapsed. But in these camps, they do a lot of singing, dancing, and different things. But they also have billboards with enemies of Putin with their pictures on it, and so there is this movement to demonize opponents. Also, the history books the history book that was adopted after the fall of the Soviet Union, they did away with the Soviet history book because there's so much propaganda in it. They had a contest basically to see, and they had a few history books that were submitted. The one that was accepted, and this is one that's used throughout Russia, is one that glorifies Putin to an extent, kind of minimizes Stalin's excesses, and just is very patriotic that way. So he's put in, not only does he have this political power, big time now, but he, as with, he's 60, 70, 80% popularity, he also has people who say, this guy, we're proud of him, he's a hero, and that has been baked into the school, in the school work that kids do, in that exposure, and in almost every newspaper and television station is under the control of Putin and his party. The one called Novaya Gazeta is still an opposition paper, but if you go too far, do any kind of investigative reporting, you can find yourself being charged with tax evasion or something, and worse. So yeah, he really, in answer to your question, I agree. I don't see him, I don't see the people rising up, because I think that can be put down. But one caveat, I never thought in my life that I'd ever see the end of the Soviet Union. Never. So, never say never in this world.
To the entire panel, what do you think Putin's view of America is and Barack Obama, and do you think that is having any impact on his decisions at all?
I think he considers Obama to be a weak leader. And I think he sees the United States being run by, it's going to sound very communist, but run by capitalist forces that are opposed to the expansion of Russia. and that's how he sees the world.
Yeah, I would agree with this. I would probably add that he is someone who is not particularly interested in personalities of American presidents.
Right.
He is very much following his own sort of agenda, and that he is taking advantage of whatever can be taken advantage of, and just proceed with the best interests of Russia.
Yeah, I mean, he was hoping that Putin was hoping that Obama would reset, and that was the big buzzword at the beginning of the Obama administration, reset relations, maybe, not the EU not being so aggressive, NATO not being so, aggressive and pushing into the Russian sphere. That didn't happen. Rather than, I have a little different take on this, rather than Putin thinking that Obama's weak, I think that he perceives Obama as being intransigent in his, view that NATO is going to do what it's going to do, and EU is going to do what it's going to do, regardless of what Russia thinks its manifest destiny is or its heritage is. And so I don't know what Obama could have done differently. I agree, personalities don't see, Obama of everybody, Obama is the great charm, hasn't gotten anywhere. The former ambassador, the ambassador that just resigned.
Michael McFaul.
Right. He was saying, I've been at dinners with Putin a lot of times, and I've been at dinners with other Russian leaders, and this guy doesn't smile, he doesn't tell a joke, and Russians are, interacting with Russians, it's usually American Russians, you do a little bit of vodka drinking, you tell some jokes, it's Putin is boy, he is cold and pragmatic and whatever you want to say. And I don't know what Obama could have done differently to have Putin think differently of him.
W told Putin to his face that he considered him to be cold-blooded.
That helps.
We talked about that actually in our foreign policy class, but what do you think, since Putin kind of addressed the U.S. and saying, if you get involved, we will fight back, what do you think is in the best interest of the U.S. to do? Is it just to impose sanctions, or do you think we should get involved, or if it escalates to a certain point, we should get involved, or?
I think this point that was made earlier, that these sanctions are being put on almost as a quid pro quo with, the annexing of with Russia getting out of the Crimea. As long as the Crimea is being controlled by Russia, then we put the sanctions on. And you wonder, we're boxing ourselves in big time because, as I said previously, I don't see Putin giving up the Crimea. So I think the best we can do at this point is to try to salvage what we can in eastern Ukraine and try to work diplomatically on that. I think it's terribly important that we don't have set ourselves up for a shooting war. And we don't place ourselves in a situation which would be unprecedented, where Russians would be shooting at Americans or Europeans and on Russian soil. I suppose except for the Civil War. But that could easily lead to tensions that could produce a nuclear standoff in the future.
There is a precedent to look at for this in history, and what I'm talking about is at the end of World War II, as the Iron Curtain fell across Europe. Two things. One, we never actually recognized that the Soviet Union had incorporated Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. We did not give it recognition. We continued to say that they were independent states. And in fact, believe it or not, all through the Cold War, there were embassies for Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and Washington, D.C., probably the only capital in the entire world that had these embassies. But once the wall figuratively came up, we didn't waste any time saying, how are we going to get Bulgaria back? What measures should we take in order to free the Romanians? We didn't do that. What we did is we did everything we could to strengthen Western Europe so that they would not be overcome by the Soviets coming out of the East. I would suggest this is very similar to what we have to do now. We don't recognize the legitimacy of the Russian annexation of Crimea, but we also don't waste time saying, what are we going to do to get Crimea back? Because that leads to the scenario that you were just talking about. You know, we could end up in a nuclear war, for heaven's sakes. You don't want to do that. What you do want to do is you want to take whatever steps are possible to strengthen the government of Ukraine so that they can resist economically, diplomatically, politically, the encroachments of Russia.
If I can also add something, and also give guarantees to Poland and the Baltic states that the United States is behind them, and that NATO protections of NATO allies, members of the alliance, are to be honored in the United States. This is precisely what explains this sudden visit that Vice President Biden has made to Poland, and making that kind of claim. So that is an important part of what happened.
More questions from people sitting?
Can I ask, collectively, what do you think Russia is after or aiming for as far as, like, are they trying to gain power eventually, or what is their, like, security interest, and also our interest as far as, like, are we trying to, like, gain allies with everyone in the world, or are we trying to still, like, gain power, or cover both countries' interests and goal?
Who were you asking?
Any or all of the speakers.
Okay, Russian interest, self-defense. Plain and simple. Russian interest, self-defense. But if you, again, you look at realist political theory, how do you protect yourself? You acquire as much power as possible. American interest, at this point, American interests are to stop the erosion of American influence through half the world, who now looks at what Chairman Mao used to refer to as a paper tiger. Russians invaded Georgia, we didn't do anything. And as a result of that, countries all over Eastern Europe that until that time were standing firm against Moscow suddenly started to send trade delegations to Moscow. And it's going to be worse now. I mean, here we are saying, oh, we have to protect democracy, et cetera, and yet here we have this annexation. You're not going to see the United States do anything about it. So we've got to do something in order to convince people that we're serious even when we're not, such as putting troops in Poland.
The United States can't do anything about Crimea. As far as giving military aid to a certain side, maybe like in Syria, the critics of Obama say should have armed the opposition early on, or in Georgia, armed the opposition, the opposition to the Russians. And now, calling for sending a whole bunch of military assistance to Ukraine. And I'm not saying that that's the wrong move, but you really have to watch it, because if you send trainers in also, and those trainers get shot at, which happened in Vietnam, then you send more troops in to protect those trainers, and you have an escalation. So it's a real tightrope that you're walking, and it's a risky deal. We don't want to appear weak, But on the other hand, one of Obama's foreign policy in the Arab Spring, and perhaps in this crisis as well, is that you don't jump into Iraq, you don't jump into Libya, unless you have international cooperation and collaboration. You don't go in there as a lone cowboy, like we did in Vietnam, like we do in Iraq, because you get bogged down there and you don't have the legitimate international legitimacy and all that kind of thing. So there's something to say for that. Now, he can be called weak for doing that. I think it's pragmatic and shrewd to go that route, rather than jump into some kind of bog, international bog.
Credibility is a very important in international politics, and Russians are now taking advantage of the fact that they are asserting their power in a region that they regard as absolutely crucial for their self-defense, and they're succeeding and just signaling that they are to be respected, at least in that part of the world. And that is not much different from what China is doing in South China Sea or what Iran is trying to do in the Middle East.
Last month, The Economist named Vladimir Putin as the most powerful man in the world. And they specifically looked at the question of President Barack Obama, because by all the indices, he should be the most powerful man in the world. We've got the strongest military, we've got the strongest economy, we still have some soft power around the world. And yet, The Economist says no, Putin is the strongest. Why? Credibility. And this was before all this in the Crimea, but they said that when Obama says there's a red line that cannot be crossed, feel free to cross it. When the Russians say there's a red line that cannot be crossed, if you cross it, you die. And that makes him a very powerful person.
This might be a very kind of vague question, but do you think that this will kind of stop at Crimea, or do you think that there are other territories that, once kind of the ball's been in motion, it's like, well, now let's just trickle into other areas, or do you think it'll stop at Crimea?
It's really scary in the eastern Ukraine, where people are chanting, and again, we don't know how, in Kharkov, for instance, if people are chanting, "We are Russians, this is the Russian Spring, save us from the fascists," all that kind of hyperbole. And it provides a pretext for the same kind of thing as Crimea, for Putin to send troops into eastern Ukraine to protect the ethnic Russians. I would think, who knows, but I think that even Putin would not do that in this situation, just because it would ratchet up the tension so much between because if the Russians go into the eastern Ukraine, what's next? The Baltic republics, et cetera, et cetera. So, who knows, but even Putin, I think, is going to, would not do that for fear of escalating this to the point where it really got dangerous in terms of a hot war between the sides.
I agree with that analysis. However, I also think that it is prudent to take people at their word. And when you read the Russian national security strategy, the Russian military strategy, the Russian foreign policy strategy, they all say the same thing, that Russia reserves the right to intervene to protect Russian citizens or Russian ethnics in the countries that they are abroad. So whereas I agree with you, I think from a real political viewpoint, he wouldn't do it. Nonetheless, I don't think we can sit here and just blindly be comfortable saying he won't do it. I think we have to be prepared for what do we do if he actually does what he says he's going to do.
And justification for what would be described as irredentism. And irredentism is this desire to protect your co-ethnics living in a neighboring country. And there are about 50 million Russians who live outside Russia, in places like Kazakhstan, Estonia, Latvia, et cetera, et cetera. And I doubt...
New York City?
Miami. North Beach and Miami. In all of those places, they are, I doubt that the Russians would raise the issue of Estonia, now that Estonia is part of NATO. But I, at the same time, wouldn't be surprised that the Russians would once again intervene in Georgia sometime in the future, or in Ukraine, if they make the calculation that their interests are being at stake.
And don't forget, Russia has been intervening in the Ukraine and in other countries of the area since at least 2006, not militarily, but through control of natural resources by cutting off the flows of natural gas. Military is not the only instrument of power.
Well, kind of leading off that, I'm curious as to what might happen to the economy, like globally, if, saying that if Russia is removed from G8 and nothing is kind of settled between Russia and the West, like, as you said, they do export a good amount of oil and gas, so what sort of implications could that have? Like, they might possibly move to isolationism even, or how could that affect global economy? I'm curious.
Russians need to sell 10 million barrels of oil a day at minimum of $90 a barrel in order to cover their budget, their governmental budget. We're talking about all the things that's keeping us from reacting to Russia. There are some lines where eventually you get to the point where Russia is constrained by us.
Yes, and Russia can be restrained also by diverting some of the supplies of natural gas away from Russia, because Russians are important suppliers of natural gas to the Europeans. But Russians, well, nowadays there are alternatives to the Russian gas. There is the Caspian Sea region as an alternative. There is now natural gas coming from Algeria and even from North America and Norway. So there are alternatives, and that can keep Russians and be some kind of an economic leverage at all.
Yeah, and the pressure is going to mount and mount in Russia, the economic pressure. It's going to hurt, it's going to be hurt, the people are going to be hurting. But Putin can, because he's got his people patriotic, he's got the support, he can say, look, I'm the captain, I'm going to steer us through these troubled waters, and it's not my fault, it's the West, and you know, I feel your pain, and we're going to explore even now, even a couple days ago, Rosneft was executives were down in Asia trying to find other sources of raw materials and whatever they need. So they're going to scramble, and they're going to try to see it through. But I'll tell you what, a lot of those oligarchs have billions of dollars in the West, and Russia depends on, and Putin's regime depends on that money. So I think it could really, really hurt, and it might eventually result in edging the two sides together diplomatically. That's really, I think, what for those of you, for this group that has studied all kinds of different crises, all kinds of different international diplomacy. It's to think outside the box. You've heard us talk about almost an insoluble problem, but is there a diplomatic way out? Is there, and it's going to have to be something that perhaps is unique, that has not been tried before. But I think that the sides are going to have to try to do that, do their best to do that, because this crisis, again, could spiral out of control.
One quick comment in relation to your question. Isolationism, I don't think is an option. The Russians have bought real estate all over the world. Some of the most expensive real estate they own in places like Miami Beach or Santa Monica or New York City or Kensington or London, for example. So they are also heavily invested in financial markets, particularly in London. And isolationism of the kind that you had during the Cold War I think is out of the question.
Any final questions? If not, I'd like to ask one final question to the panel. Today, Ukraine has authorized its forces to protect themselves after a death of a Ukrainian soldier. If military conflict breaks out between both nations, what chances does Ukraine have against Russia in an armed conflict?
None. Yeah, they don't, but they're going to, again, ask for a military aid from the West. They're going to ask for a backup from the West, and we'll see if that has any deterrent at all. But I pretty much agree that it's if they actually got into a shooting war, there would be no way that they could stand up against, just like Georgia, there's no way they could stand up against the Russian army. Hate to end on it.
Well, if there's no more questions, thank you everyone.